Summer 1944, the heat lay heavy over the flatlands, pressing down until the dust on the road seemed to sweat. Cicadas rasped like tiny saws in the trees, and the river, wide and slow as a sleeping hound, gleamed beneath the sun. Beyond the chain-link fence of Fort Concord, a truck rattled to a stop and a dozen German prisoners clambered down, their boots raising small clouds of yellow grit. Their uniforms, once gray-green, were bleached and frayed from months of war and capture. Some still carried themselves like soldiers, others looked like scarecrows, hollow-eyed and stunned by how far they had fallen. Lieutenant Jack Whitaker stood with his hat brim low, watching them file into the yard. He was 24, whip-thin, with a face that never quite lost its solemn cast. His rifle rested against his shoulder, but his eyes were elsewhere, on the river, just visible through the trees beyond the camp. He had grown up swimming there, in summers before Pearl Harbor, before his name had been stitched on khaki. The water had been his refuge, his place to think. Now, in the strange reversal of wartime, it was being offered to the enemy. "They look like they might melt before they make it to the gate," drawled Sergeant Will Harlan from the guard tower ladder. Harlan was twice Jack's age, a man whose leathery skin looked sunburned even in winter, who spoke like he was chewing gravel. He spat into the dust, then squinted at the prisoners with a mixture of pity and contempt. "War must be over if we're running a summer camp for Jerry." Jack didn't answer right away. He watched as one of the prisoners, tall, broad-shouldered, with a neat haircut that had somehow survived months of capture, paused to adjust his cap. Even from this distance, his posture spoke of habit and dignity. Jack felt an odd flicker of respect, though he pushed it aside. "Orders are orders," he said finally. "Colonel says they get river privileges. Geneva Convention and all." "Privileges," Harlan muttered. "Next we'll be knitting them Christmas stockings." But there was no real anger in his voice, only the kind of gruff resignation that came from knowing he'd be here all summer, watching these men work the fields and swim in the water he had always called his own. The prisoners were marched to the barracks, and Jack found himself walking parallel to them, boots crunching in time. The tall one glanced at him once, quick and curious, and for an instant Jack saw not a soldier but a man about his own age, someone who might have been walking to church on a Sunday morning back in Kansas or Bavaria. He looked away sharply, ashamed of the thought. That night, the air inside the guardhouse was thick as syrup. The men played cards under the dim light bulb, sweat trickling down their backs. A few mosquitoes whined near the window screens. Harlan dealt a hand and said, "You really gonna let him in that river tomorrow?" Jack glanced up from his cards. "What do you mean, let them?" "We don't have much choice. I mean, what if one just keeps swimming? You planning on diving in after him, Lieutenant?" Harlan's tone was half serious, half testing, like a man poking at a fresh bruise. Jack hesitated, imagining the current, the glint of wet shoulders disappearing beyond the bend. "If they try it, we do what we're told," he said finally, though he couldn't bring himself to say aloud what that meant. Rifles, shouts, the water running red. Morning broke hot and gold. The prisoners were lined up and escorted through the gate toward the riverbank. They walked warily, as if they expected the ground to vanish under their feet. Some of them murmured to one another in German, others kept their heads down. Jack walked beside them, feeling the sweat gather under his collar. At the water's edge, they stopped. The river glittered like spilled mercury, dragonflies flashing blue in the reeds. The guards stood back, rifles slung but ready. "Go on," Jack said, nodding. The prisoners hesitated, looking at one another. One young man, barely more than a boy, blond hair sticking up in the heat, laughed suddenly and kicked off his boots. He waded in up to his knees, gasped at the temperature, then dove headfirst. The splash broke the spell. Soon they were all in, whooping and shouting like schoolboys, water arcing into the air. Some floated on their backs, staring up at the cloudless sky. Others dunked each other, laughing so hard they had to cling to the bank for breath. Jack stood on the shore, shading his eyes. Something in his chest loosened as he watched them. Men who had been his enemies yesterday now bobbing like corks, their rifles and machine guns replaced by dripping hands and sunburnt smiles. Even Harlan cracked a grin. "Look at him," he said. "You'd think we were hosting a church picnic." For a while the camp felt transformed, almost peaceful. The prisoners returned to shore reluctantly, wringing water from their sleeves. Jack noticed the tall one again, standing apart from the rest, quietly watching the current as if memorizing its shape. When their eyes met, the man gave the barest nod, a gesture that felt heavier than words. That night, as the guards locked up the compound, the sky turned purple with twilight. Jack lingered by the fence, staring toward the river. He could still hear the echoes of the day, the laughter, the splashing, and it unsettled him. He had expected hostility, bitterness, perhaps an attempt to run. Instead, he had seen something startlingly close to joy. Inside the barracks, the prisoners were quiet, exhausted from sun and water. Jack made his rounds, flashlight sweeping over sleeping forms. The young blonde one mumbled in his dreams, smiling faintly even in sleep. Jack felt an unexpected tug of pity. On his way back to the guardhouse, he stopped short. There, half buried near the fence, was a scrap of rope. He crouched and picked it up, rough hemp worn at the edges as though it had been handled many times. It could have been nothing, discarded from some supply crate, but Jack's stomach tightened. He looked toward the barracks, then toward the river beyond the trees, black now under the rising moon. When he returned to the guardhouse, Harlan was pouring coffee, the bitter smell filling the air. "Something wrong?" he asked, catching Jack's expression. Jack set the rope on the table. "Found this near the fence." Harlan studied it, then shrugged. "Could be anything. Could be." Jack tried to sound casual, but the weight of the day pressed down on him. He thought of the prisoners laughing, of the tall one's nod, of the boy's carefree dive. He thought of how easy it would be for one of them to slip away in the current, carried downriver before the guards even noticed. Outside, the night hummed with crickets. Jack sat down, listening to the sound of the river in the distance, soft and steady like a heartbeat. Tomorrow they would swim again. And tomorrow, he thought, he might not get them all back. The second morning broke with a thin mist rising off the river, curling through the trees like ghost smoke. Jack stood at the edge of the campyard, hands in his pockets, watching the prisoners assemble. The air still smelled of dew and wet earth, but he felt the same coiled unease he had carried since finding the rope. Harlan came up beside him, yawning and scratching his jaw. "You gonna brood every time we take him swimming?" he asked, though there was no malice in it. "Just thinking," Jack said, though that wasn't the half of it. The memory of the tall prisoner's nod haunted him, somewhere between gratitude and calculation. The march to the river was quieter today. The men's steps fell in rhythm, but they kept glancing toward the trees, as though testing the truth of this strange freedom. When they reached the bank, the blond boy, Joseph, Jack had learned, didn't wait for permission. He peeled off his shirt and dove in, shouting something in German that made the others laugh. Soon the whole group followed, splashes echoing off the water like rifle cracks. Jack found himself smiling despite the knot in his chest. The river looked different today, brighter somehow, as if it had accepted them all. The guards stood watch, their boots sinking into the damp sand. Even Harlan, leaning on his rifle, seemed to soften. "Hell," he muttered, "they're like kids at the county fair." Friedrich Adler, the tall lieutenant, entered the water last. He waded in with a deliberate grace, as though performing a ritual. Once chest deep, he dipped under, then came up slick with river weed, blinking. Jack caught his eye, and this time it was Friedrich who nodded first. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement that neither quite wanted to name. The day's heat rose fast. By noon the prisoners were sprawled on the grass, drying in the sun like a herd of contented cattle. A few sang softly in their language, low tunes that made Jack think of church hymns. One of them produced a stub of charcoal and a scrap of paper and began sketching the riverbank, the trees, even the guards. "What's he drawing?" Harlan asked. Jack crouched to look, and the prisoner held up the page shyly. The sketch was good, sharp lines and careful shading that caught the curve of the river, the bent posture of Harlan's stance. There was something almost tender in the way he had captured it. "He's an artist," Jack said, handing it back. "Or a cartographer," Harlan grumbled. But he didn't tear it up, only went back to watching the tree line. Work details followed the swim. The prisoners loaded crates, repaired fences, and hoed the vegetable patch under the eye of the guards. They moved with a peculiar mix of discipline and boredom, as though the war had drained them but left behind the habits of soldiers. Jack watched Friedrich bend to lift a heavy post, his muscles taut, his expression unreadable. After supper, as dusk pooled along the horizon, Jack found himself writing a letter to his mother. He told her about the river, about the prisoners laughing, about how strange it was to see men who had fought in France splashing like farmhands on a Sunday. "I don't know what to make of it," he wrote. "Sometimes it feels like the war has already ended here, even if it hasn't out there." He didn't mention the rope. By the third day, the routine had taken hold. The prisoners no longer hesitated at the water's edge. They ran, dove, shouted. The guards began to relax too, letting their rifles hang loose as they smoked and joked. The camp dog, an old mutt named Rusty, followed them to the river and barked at the splashes, tail wagging. But not everything felt easy. Jack noticed that one of the prisoners, Otto Riedel, hung back during the swims. He would wade in, splash his face, then sit on the bank staring downstream as if measuring the distance. His jaw was square, his gaze sharp. Jack made a note of it, though he said nothing to Harlan. That afternoon, as the men prepared to return, Joseph swam out farther than usual. His blond head bobbed against the sun glare, drifting toward the bend. Jack's stomach clenched. "Kraus!" he shouted, surprising himself with the sharpness of his voice. Joseph turned, grinning, and began a lazy crawl back toward shore. When he finally reached the bank, coughing and laughing, Harlan stepped forward. "You trying to give us a heart attack, kid?" he growled. Joseph didn't understand the words, but caught the tone and raised his hands in apology. The others laughed, but the sound had a nervous edge. That night, a storm rolled in from the west. The wind pressed against the barracks, and the rain drummed the roof. Jack sat on the porch of the guardhouse, boots up on the railing, staring into the wet dark. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the fence, the trees, the narrow path to the river. For a moment he thought he saw movement near the far corner of the compound, but when the darkness closed again, it was gone. Harlan joined him, coffee steaming in his hand. "You're jumpy as a rabbit tonight," he said. "I just keep thinking how easy it would be," Jack admitted. "River's high after that rain. Current would carry a man half a mile before we even lit the searchlights." "Maybe so." Harlan sipped, unbothered. "But most of 'em don't want to escape. They know they got it good here." "Most," Jack said. The next day dawned hot again, steam rising off the grass. The prisoners marched to the river as usual, but the storm had changed its face. The current was faster, swirling with branches and leaves. Still, they waded in, laughing at the chill. Joseph splashed Friedrich, who dunked him in retaliation. The guards laughed too, for a moment forgetting themselves. Jack noticed Otto again, standing thigh-deep, scanning the far bank. His lips moved, though no one was near enough to hear. Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. When the men returned to camp, Jack lingered at the rear. The river shimmered behind him, restless and brown. He knelt near the spot where he'd found the rope and pressed his hand into the damp earth. There, faint but clear, were footprints, fresh ones, heading toward the water. The discovery lodged in him like a stone. He said nothing at roll call, nothing during supper, but his eyes kept straying to Otto, who ate in silence, shoulders tense. Friedrich noticed too. Their gazes met briefly across the mess hall, and Jack could have sworn he saw a question there. After lights out, the camp fell quiet except for the chorus of frogs from the river. Jack walked the perimeter slowly, moonlight catching on the barbed wire. The air smelled of wet clay and honeysuckle. Somewhere an owl called. Everything looked normal, and yet the unease would not leave him. Back in the guardhouse, he sat at the table, listening to the hum of the night. The rope lay where he had left it days ago. He picked it up, coiling and uncoiling it in his hands. The texture was rough, scratchy, like a question that refused to be answered. Through the open window came the sound of distant water, rushing faster after the storm, carrying twigs and leaves and perhaps, one day soon, something more. Jack stared into the darkness until his eyes ached, and thought, if they run, it will be here, it will be soon. Somewhere beyond the barracks, a board creaked, faint as a breath. Jack rose, every nerve taut. The night was still again, as if it had swallowed the sound whole. He stood there for a long moment, hand on the rifle sling, listening to the river's whisper. When he finally sat down again, he could still feel the echo of that sound in his bones, and it left him with a single, unshakable certainty. Tomorrow, something would happen. Something that would change the river forever. By dawn the air was already thick enough to drink, heavy with the damp sweetness of river mud. Jack walked the perimeter slowly, his boots leaving dark prints in the dew. Each step felt deliberate, as if he could press the tension into the ground and leave it behind. The prisoners stirred in the barracks, their voices muffled through the walls, low German syllables, some laughing, some arguing. He caught a sharper tone, a word repeated twice, almost spat. He didn't speak much German, but he knew the sound of men planning something. At breakfast the men were subdued, as though saving their breath. Otto Riedel sat apart, head down, jaw clenched. Friedrich Adler glanced at him once, then went back to eating, expression unreadable. Jack noticed how the other prisoners' eyes kept straying toward the door, toward the tree line beyond the fence, as if measuring it. When it was time for the river, the tension walked with them like a shadow. The guards were alert now, rifles held a little higher. Harlan muttered under his breath, "Feels like we're marching them to a wedding or a hanging, can't tell which." At the bank, Joseph was the first in as always, splashing and shouting to break the unease. Soon the water was alive with motion, but Jack could feel the difference, an edge under the laughter, a quickness in their glances. Otto stayed near the far side of the group, drifting a little farther downstream. Jack watched him, pulse steady but fast. Then Friedrich swam to where Otto lingered and said something sharp, gesturing toward the guards. Otto's mouth curled in a smirk. The two men exchanged words too low to carry over the water, and then Friedrich turned and swam back to shore, his face carved in stone. When the swim ended and the prisoners trudged back, Jack kept his eyes on Friedrich. There was a set to his shoulders that hadn't been there before, as though some decision had been made. Later, during the work detail, Jack found him sketching again, this time on the back of a scrap ration list. The drawing showed the riverbank from a new angle, the view as if seen from halfway across. It was precise, shaded with care, and Jack couldn't decide whether it was art or reconnaissance. "You've got talent," Jack said, crouching down. Friedrich glanced up, surprised, then nodded slightly. "It passes the time," he said, his English careful, accented. "You were talking to Riedel earlier." Jack kept his tone casual. "Everything all right?" Friedrich's pencil hovered above the page. "He thinks the war is not over. He thinks he should still fight." "And you?" Friedrich's eyes met his. "I think the war is over. For us, at least." He set the charcoal down, wiping his hands. "But some men do not know how to stop." That night Jack told Harlan about the exchange. The older man shrugged. "Let 'em try. We'll catch 'em or we won't. Either way, it ain't our war anymore. Just our job." "Maybe," Jack said, but the thought of gunfire near the riverbank made his stomach twist. He didn't want blood in that water, didn't want to see its quiet surface shattered. 2 days later the storm heat broke, leaving the air bright and clean. The men marched to the river under a sky so blue it hurt the eyes. The current had slowed again, glassy and inviting. The prisoners dove in, shouting, their bodies shining in the sun. For a moment Jack let himself relax. The world felt simple again. Water, sun, laughter. Then Joseph swam too far, his head bobbing toward the bend. "Get back!" Jack shouted, but the boy didn't hear or didn't care. The current caught him, spinning him halfway around. Jack cursed and kicked off his boots, splashing in before Harlan could protest. The river closed over his shoulders, cool and deep. He swam hard, the current pulling at his legs. Joseph's head was only a pale blur ahead of him now. "Stop!" Jack shouted, water filling his mouth. Joseph turned, saw him, and in his panic flailed instead of swimming. When Jack reached him, he grabbed the boy by the collar and hauled him back stroke by stroke until they reached the bank. They collapsed in the shallows, gasping. The other prisoners stood silently, watching. Joseph coughed, spitting water, then began to laugh, a thin, nervous sound that quickly spread through the others. Even Harlan's mouth twitched. "You trying to drown yourself, kid?" he asked, shaking his head. Jack pushed himself up, chest heaving. His heart pounded with more than exertion. He had felt for a moment that he was pulling not just a boy but the entire fragile piece back from the edge. That night the barracks buzzed with low voices. Word of Joseph's near drowning spread quickly, turning into a story already half legend among the men. Some said he had been trying to escape, others swore he just got caught in the current. Jack sat on the guardhouse steps, listening to the murmurs, wondering which story Otto would choose to believe. Friedrich came to the fence under the pretense of smoking a cigarette. When he saw Jack nearby, he said quietly, "You saved him." "Had to," Jack said. Friedrich exhaled smoke toward the stars. "Not everyone would have." Something in his tone made Jack look closer. "You know what Riedel's planning, don't you?" Friedrich didn't answer at once. Then he ground the cigarette into the dirt. "He will not stop talking about it. The river, the far bank, the road beyond. He says it would be easy." Jack's hand tightened on the fence wire. "And what do you say?" "I say easy is not the same as right." Friedrich turned, walking back toward the barracks without another word. The next day felt stretched thin, brittle as glass. The prisoners worked silently, as if holding their breath. Even Joseph was subdued, his usual chatter gone. When the time came for swimming, Jack hesitated, then gave the order. Better to keep the routine, he thought. Better to see what would happen under watchful eyes than let it boil in secret. At the water's edge, Otto moved first, wading in with deliberate slowness. He swam out farther than anyone, stopping just short of the point where the current quickened. Jack's finger twitched near the trigger guard. Then Friedrich swam out after him. They spoke, voices tight, gestures sharp. Otto turned away, defiant, but after a moment he swam back toward shore, strokes hard with anger. When they emerged dripping onto the bank, Friedrich's jaw was set. His eyes fixed on Jack as though silently saying, "I held him back this time." The tension didn't break, it only coiled tighter. Jack knew it couldn't last, not with the river shining like a promise beyond the trees. That night, after lights out, Jack walked the perimeter again. The moon was nearly full, silvering the fence and the grass. Somewhere a board creaked again near the far corner, faint but clear this time. He froze, breath held, listening. The sound came once more, a footstep, soft on wet earth. Jack gripped his rifle and moved toward the sound, every sense stretched taut as wire. Beyond the fence, just at the tree line, he saw a shadow slip out of sight toward the river. The night smelled of rain before it came. The air was so heavy it seemed to press the crickets silent, and every sound carried far. An owl's call, the creak of the watchtower, the slow shuffle of boots on gravel. Jack stood near the gate with his rifle slung, feeling the storm gathering like a held breath. He couldn't shake the image of that shadow slipping toward the river. All day the camp had hummed with a strange tension. The prisoners worked quickly, talking little, and when evening came their eyes followed the guards like watchful cats. By the time darkness fell, thunder grumbled beyond the horizon. The prisoners were locked in, lights out, but Jack knew sleep would not come easily for them, or for him. He found Friedrich standing at the window of the barracks, hands on the sill, looking out at the sky. When their eyes met, Friedrich didn't flinch. "You will need to watch tonight," he said quietly, the words in careful English. "Riedel is ready." Jack felt the warning like a jolt of cold water. You could have stayed quiet. Friedrich's jaw tightened. "I do not want him to ruin what we have." His gaze shifted toward the river, visible only as a darker stripe against the night. "Tomorrow, they will know the war is almost finished. But he wants to end it his way." The first drops of rain began to fall, tapping on the tin roofs. Jack nodded once and moved back toward the guardhouse. Inside, Harlan was already pouring coffee, the pot rattling against the burner. "Figured we'd need it," the sergeant said. His face was calm, but his eyes narrowed when he saw Jack's expression. "Tonight's the night," Jack said simply. Harlan grunted. "Figures they'd pick a storm for cover." He checked the action on his rifle. Well, at least the mud will slow him down. Lightning flashed, turning the camp white for an instant, and then thunder cracked close enough to make the windows rattle. Rain came in earnest now, drumming on the roofs, pooling in the yard. Jack pulled on his slicker and stepped out into the wet dark. The river's roar was louder than usual, swollen from days of storms, and it sounded almost like a living thing, hungry, restless. Near midnight, he heard it, the faint scrape of metal, the quick hiss of a voice. He sprinted toward the far corner of the fence, Harlan close behind. In the flash of lightning they saw them, two shadows slipping under the wire, bellies pressed to the mud, moving fast toward the trees. "Halt!" Jack shouted, but the wind snatched the word away. The figures ran, splashing through puddles. A third shape appeared, Friedrich, running the opposite direction, shouting in German. His voice cut through the rain, urgent, commanding. One of the escapees faltered, glancing back, but Otto did not. Jack raised his rifle. For a heartbeat he saw only the outline of a man in the rain, bent forward, desperate. Then Friedrich tackled Otto from the side, driving him into the mud. They struggled, rolling toward the tree line. Jack and Harlan reached them, boots sinking deep. Harlan yanked Otto up by the collar, his rifle jammed against the man's ribs. Otto spat mud and curses, thrashing until Jack grabbed his wrists and bound them with rope. Friedrich lay on his back in the rain, chest heaving, eyes squeezed shut. When the prisoners were hauled back inside, the rest of the men were awake, crowding the windows. Their faces were pale, shadows of fear and relief flickering across them. Jack locked the barracks door, then turned to Friedrich, who stood dripping like a scarecrow. "You didn't have to stop him," Jack said quietly. Friedrich's expression was unreadable. If he escaped, there would be blood. On the river, maybe here. I will not have that. Outside, the storm raged harder, lightning strobing across the yard. Jack felt the tremor of adrenaline in his limbs. Something had been decided tonight, something larger than just one failed escape. The fragile truce between guard and prisoner had been tested and held. When dawn came, the storm was gone. The river steamed in the morning light, its surface smooth again, as though nothing had disturbed it. The prisoners were silent at roll call, their faces turned toward the ground. Otto stood apart, shackled, his defiance burned down to a sullen coal. Jack dismissed the work detail for the day. The men sat outside, shirts off, letting the sun dry them. Joseph plucked at a wet blade of grass, restless, then looked up at Jack with a tentative grin. Jack didn't return it, not yet, but something inside him loosened. Later, near the riverbank, he found Friedrich sitting alone, sketchbook in hand. The page showed the night storm, rain slashing across the camp, a single figure standing near the fence like a sentinel. "That's supposed to be me?" Jack asked. Friedrich didn't look up. "It is the river's memory," he said. Jack watched the water slide past, glinting gold in the sun. It seemed impossible that hours ago it had been a black, roaring thing threatening to swallow them all. He realized the river had become something more than a place to swim. It was the measure of trust between them, a test they would face again and again until the war truly ended. He turned back toward camp, hearing the splash of fish in the shallows, the rustle of trees drying in the sun. Behind him, Friedrich kept sketching, the scratch of charcoal steady and calm. That night, as darkness settled soft and quiet over Fort Concord, Jack walked to the edge of the water. The river caught the moonlight and held it, silver and unbroken. Somewhere downstream, the current would carry away the footprints, the struggle, the fear. But here, tonight, the bank stood clean. He thought of the gunshot he hadn't fired, the man he hadn't killed, and the enemy who had chosen mercy over silence. The war wasn't finished, but something had ended here anyway, ended and begun again. Jack took a breath and let it out slowly, feeling the tension slip away like silt on the current. When he turned back toward the camp, the river stayed behind him, whispering softly in the dark, like a secret that would never fully let go. Far off, thunder muttered one last time, rolling into the distance, but the sky above remained clear. And for the first time since the prisoners had arrived, Jack felt certain they would all see the morning together.